The desert sky was ablaze with crimson and gold as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. But Genevieve Harrington noticed none of its beauty. Her world had narrowed to the rough wooden boards beneath her cheek and the fire that seemed to consume her from within. She had collapsed on the porch of her small homestead outside Ash Fork, Arizona Territory, sometime during the night, too weak to make it inside after returning from the creek where she desperately tried to cool her burning skin. It was 1882, and out here, 30 miles from town, a fever could be a death sentence for a woman alone. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered through her delirium. She didn't even raise her head when the horse stopped, nor when boots thudded against the hard, packed earth of her yard. "Miss, are you all right?" The deep voice floated through her consciousness like it came from underwater. Rough, gentle hands turned her over, and Genevieve's bleary eyes focused momentarily on the concerned face of a stranger. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a sun-weathered face partially hidden beneath several days' worth of beard, he wore the dusty clothes and wide-brimmed hat of a cowboy. "Water," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking from her parched throat. "Hold on," he said, straightening up. "I'll get you inside." She felt herself being lifted, cradled against a solid chest that smelled of leather, horses, and the open range. As the stranger carried her through the doorway of her small cabin, darkness overtook her once more. When Genevieve next opened her eyes, she was lying in her bed, covered with a thin sheet. A cool cloth lay across her forehead, and the stranger sat in the room's only chair, which he'd pulled up beside her. Outside, night had fallen. "You're awake," he said, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" "Like death warmed over," Genevieve murmured, attempting to sit up. "Easy now," the cowboy said, gently pushing her back down. "You've got a bad fever. Been out most of the day." "Who are you?" she asked, studying his face in the lamplight. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably no more than 30, with dark eyes that held a kindness she hadn't expected. "Name's Vincent Blackburn," he replied, dipping the cloth in a basin of water before returning it to her forehead. "Most folks call me Vince. I was passing through on my way to Prescott when I saw you lying there. Couldn't just ride on by." "Genevieve Harrington," she offered weakly. "Thank you for stopping." "You've been alone out here?" he asked, his brow furrowing. She nodded slightly. "My father passed last winter. I've been running the place since." Vincent's expression registered surprise, but he said nothing about a woman managing a homestead alone, something that had drawn plenty of commentary from others. "You need a doctor," he said instead. "I could ride to Ash Fork." "No," she interrupted. 2 days ride there and back. I'll either be better or dead by then." She attempted a smile that turned into a grimace as a wave of pain washed over her. Vincent stood and paced the small room. "I've seen fevers like this before. You need medicine, care." "There's willow bark in that jar," she said, pointing weakly to a shelf. "If you could make a tea." He nodded and set to work, building up the fire in her small stove and finding the kettle. Genevieve watched through half-closed eyes as this stranger moved around her home with careful efficiency. "I'll stay," he said suddenly, his back to her as he worked. "At least through the night. See if the fever breaks." She wanted to protest a strange man in her home went against everything she'd been raised to believe proper, but the reality of her situation silenced her objections. "Thank you," was all she managed before sleep claimed her again. The night passed in fragments for Genevieve, moments of lucidity punctuated by dreams and delirium. Through it all, Vincent remained a constant presence, coaxing water and tea between her lips, changing the cloth on her forehead, speaking softly when nightmares made her cry out. Once, she awoke to find him asleep in the chair, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. Even in her fevered state, Something about his vigilance touched her deeply. When dawn broke again, Genevieve opened her eyes to find Vincent watching her intently, circles of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "The fever's down some," he said, pressing a hand to her cheek. His touch was cool against her skin. "You stayed all night," she observed, her voice stronger than it had been the previous day. He nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "I said I would." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Vincent looked away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Because everyone deserves someone to care when they're suffering." He paused, then added simply, "I will care, Miss Harrington, until you're well enough that you don't need me to." The directness of his words and the honesty in his eyes stirred something in Genevieve's chest that had nothing to do with her fever. By midday, Genevieve could sit up and take broth that Vincent had prepared from her meager supplies. The fever hadn't broken completely, but it had receded enough that her mind was clear. "You have livestock that need tending?" Vincent asked as he cleared away the dishes. "Some chickens in the coop out back," she replied, "and a milk cow in the small pasture." You should rest," he interrupted firmly. "I'll see to them." Genevieve watched from the window as Vincent moved about her property, feeding the chickens, milking the cow, and repairing a loose board on the chicken coop that she'd been meaning to fix for weeks. There was an easy competence to his movements that spoke of a lifetime of such work. When he returned, she asked, "Where were you headed before you found me?" Vincent hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Prescott, like I said. There's work there for a man who knows horses." "You don't have a regular outfit?" He shook his head. "Not anymore. I was with the Diamond R spread north of Flagstaff for 5 years, but the owner sold out this spring. Been drifting since, taking work where I can find it. No family waiting somewhere." The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. A shadow crossed his face. "No, madam, not for a long time now." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken history, and Genevieve didn't press further. Instead, she said, "You don't have to stay. I'm feeling much better." "That fever could come back just as quick as it went," Vincent replied. "If you don't mind, I'd like to see you through another day at least." She should mind. A proper lady would insist he leave. But the prospect of being alone again, especially while still weak from illness, held little appeal. "I'd be grateful," she admitted finally. As dusk settled over the small homestead, Vincent sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge one by one. Genevieve, wrapped in a blanket, joined him, settling carefully beside him. "Beautiful night," he commented, glancing at her. "Should you be up?" "I've been in that bed all day," she replied. "I needed some air." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the desert night growing cool around them. In the distance, a coyote called and another answered. "How did you end up out here alone?" Vincent asked finally. Genevieve sighed, drawing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "My father brought us west from Boston after my mother died. He had dreams of building something of his own, away from the shadow of her family. I was 15 then. And now?" 23, she replied. 8 years of watching him pour everything into this place. When the consumption took him, I couldn't bear to leave it all behind." Vincent nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's not an easy life for anyone out here, let alone a woman on her own." "I manage," she said, a touch of defiance in her voice. "Or I did until this fever laid me low." "Everyone needs help sometimes," he observed. "No shame in that." Genevieve studied his profile in the dim light. "And you, what's your story, Mr. Blackburn?" A small smile touched his lips. "Nothing as interesting as yours, I expect. Born in Texas, raised on saddles and cattle drives. My father was a foreman on a big ranch there. Taught me everything I know about horses and cattle before he passed." "And your mother?" "Died when I was 12. Fever like what you had." The simple statement explained much about his care for her over the past day and night. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Vincent shrugged. "It was a long time ago." He was silent for a moment, then continued. "I left Texas when I was 18. Been working my way around the territory since. Arizona's starting to feel like home, though." "It grows on you," Genevieve agreed, looking out at the shadowy outline of the distant mountains. "I hated it at first, so different from Boston, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." They talked well into the night, sharing pieces of their lives as the stars wheeled overhead. Genevieve found herself speaking of things she'd told no one: her fear after her father's death, her determination to make the homestead work, the loneliness of the past winter. Vincent listened without judgment, occasionally offering an observation or a story of his own. When Genevieve finally returned to her bed, exhausted but feeling stronger than she had in days, she realized it had been months since she'd spoken so freely with another person. Something about Vincent Blackburn made it easy to trust him, despite having known him only a day. The following morning, Genevieve awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly and found Vincent at the stove, cooking breakfast as though he'd done so in her kitchen 100 times before. "You should be resting," he admonished when he saw her, but there was a smile in his eyes. "I'm much better," she insisted, and it was true. The fever had broken completely during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. "Good enough to eat a real meal, I hope." They ate together at her small table, and for a brief moment, Genevieve could almost pretend this was normal, sharing breakfast with someone, having conversation to start the day instead of silence. After the meal, Vincent said, "I should check your supplies, see what you need. I could ride into Ash Fork tomorrow, bring back provisions." Genevieve hesitated. "I don't want to delay your journey to Prescott. The jobs will still be there a few days from now," he replied with a casual shrug that didn't quite hide the intentionality of his offer. "Why would you do that?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by his continued assistance. Vincent met her gaze directly. "Because you needed help yesterday and you still do today. That's reason enough for me." Such straightforward goodness was rare in her experience, especially from a man with no obvious motive. The cynical part of her, the part that had learned wariness during her years in the territory, searched for ulterior motives, but found none in his open expression. "All right," she agreed finally. "I'd appreciate that. I have money set aside for supplies." They spent the day with Genevieve resting while Vincent tended to chores around the homestead, fixing the sagging gate on the corral, patching a leak in the roof that had been troubling her since the spring rains, splitting firewood that would last her for weeks. By sunset, he had accomplished more than she could have done in a month. As they ate a simple supper, Vincent asked, "Is there anything particular you need from town?" "Besides the usual supplies," Genevieve considered. "Seeds, if they have any left this late in the season. And perhaps some fabric. I've been mending these same dresses for too long." He nodded, committing her requests to memory. "I should reach town by midday tomorrow if I leave at first light. Be back the following evening, most likely." "You don't need to hurry back," she said, though part of her hoped he would. Something in her tone must have revealed her thoughts, for Vincent smiled slightly. "I'll be back as quick as I can," he promised. That night, as Genevieve lay in bed listening to Vincent's quiet movements as he settled on the pallet he'd made for himself near the stove, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been entirely alone, facing each day with the grim determination that had characterized her existence since her father's death. Now, a stranger had upended that solitude, bringing not only practical help, but a warmth she'd almost forgotten could exist. It was dangerous to become accustomed to his presence, she knew. Vincent Blackburn was a drifter by his own admission, heading for work in Prescott. Whatever his reasons for helping her, they wouldn't keep him here indefinitely. Soon enough, she would return to her solitary life. But for now, the simple comfort of another person's breathing in the darkness was enough to lull her into the deepest, most restful sleep she'd had in months. The morning brought a brilliant, cloudless sky, and Vincent was up before dawn, preparing for his ride to town. Genevieve insisted on making breakfast despite his protests that she should rest. "I'm not an invalid anymore," she told him firmly, "and you'll need a proper meal before your journey." As they ate, Vincent detailed the repairs he'd noticed the homestead still needed. "The south corner of the barn roof needs attention before winter," he said. "And that windmill could use some work. The well's good, though clean water and plenty of it." His thorough assessment reminded Genevieve of her father's careful stewardship of the property. It felt strange to discuss these matters with someone else after handling everything alone for so long, but there was also a relief in sharing the burden, however temporarily. When it was time for him to leave, Vincent checked his saddle bags and mounted his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a white blaze. "Anything else you think of while I'm gone, just add it to the list," he said, settling his hat more firmly against the morning sun. "Be careful," Genevieve replied, suddenly anxious about his departure. "The trail can be dangerous." Vincent smiled down at her, his expression gentle. "I've ridden worse. Don't worry about me." He hesitated, then added, "You take care while I'm gone. Don't overdo it." She nodded, and with a touch of his hat brim, he turned his horse and rode out, following the faint trail that eventually joined the main road to Ash Fork. Genevieve watched until he disappeared over a rise, then returned to the quiet house that somehow seemed emptier than it had before his arrival. Despite Vincent's admonition to rest, Genevieve couldn't abide sitting idle all day. She tackled light chores, gathering eggs from the chicken coop and tending to her small garden, which had suffered from neglect during her illness. By mid-afternoon, however, her strength began to wane, and she was forced to acknowledge that she hadn't fully recovered. She spent the evening on the porch, watching the sunset and thinking about Vincent Blackburn. In just 3 days, he had transformed from stranger to what? Not quite a friend, but something more than a passing acquaintance. His kindness had been offered freely, without expectation of return, a rare commodity in a territory where most relationships were built on mutual need or advantage. The following day passed slowly for Genevieve. She found herself listening for hoofbeats, glancing frequently down the trail that led to her homestead. By late afternoon, when there was still no sign of Vincent, she began to worry. Bandits sometimes prowled the roads, preying on lone travelers. Or perhaps he had simply decided not to return to continue on to Prescott as he'd originally planned, leaving her to manage as she had before. The thought brought an unexpected pang of disappointment. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, his steady competence, the way he filled the silences without effort. Twilight deepened into true darkness, and Genevieve reluctantly lit the lamp in the window, a beacon for any traveler, but especially for Vincent, should he still be on the trail. She had just resigned herself to spending another night alone when she heard the distant sound of hooves approaching at a steady pace. Relief washed over her as she stepped onto the porch. Soon, Vincent's broad-shouldered silhouette materialized from the darkness, his horse plodding tiredly beneath him. Behind him, a second horse pulled a small cart laden with supplies. "You're back," Genevieve said, unable to keep the gladness from her voice as he dismounted in the yard. Vincent smiled, the exhaustion on his face giving way to warmth. "Told you I would be. Took longer than I expected, had to wait on some of your supplies." "You brought a wagon?" she asked, eyeing the cart. "Borrowed it," he explained, "from the mercantile owner. There was more to carry than I could manage on horseback." Together, they unloaded the provisions: flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, ammunition for her father's old rifle, and sundry other necessities. Vincent had also brought the fabric she'd requested, along with a paper of needles, thread, and even a small packet of ribbon that he presented almost shyly. "Thought it might brighten one of those dresses you mentioned," he said when she examined it. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Genevieve deeply. It had been so long since anyone had given her something simply for pleasure rather than necessity. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." As they sorted through the supplies by lamplight, Vincent mentioned casually, "I spoke with the doctor in town, described your symptoms. He sent some medicine that should help build your strength back." Genevieve raised an eyebrow. "That must have cost a pretty penny." Vincent shrugged. "Consider it my contribution to your recovery." She started to protest, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Please, let me do this small thing." There was something in his expression that made further argument impossible. Instead, she nodded her acceptance. "Then I insist you stay for supper. It's the least I can do after your long journey." They ate together at her small table, and Vincent shared news from town. A new family had arrived to settle nearby. The railroad surveyors had been through again, and the territory was buzzing with talk of eventual statehood. "The mercantile owner Jenkins asked how you were faring out here alone," Vincent mentioned. "Seemed concerned about you." Genevieve sighed. "Mr. Jenkins has a widowed sister. He's been trying to match me with his son for 2 years now. His concern is more for his family's prospects than for my welfare." Vincent's mouth twitched in amusement. He did mention his boy Thomas an unusual number of times. "Thomas Jenkins is a fine young man," Genevieve admitted, "but he has no interest in a hardscrabble life on a homestead, and I have no interest in being a shopkeeper's wife in town." "What do you want?" Vincent asked, his gaze thoughtful. The directness of the question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years, perhaps ever. Her father had assumed she shared his dream of the homestead. The townsfolk assumed she would eventually give up and either marry or return east. "I want this place to thrive," she said finally. "I want to see my father's vision realized, a prosperous homestead that belongs solely to us, beholden to no one, and I want—" She hesitated, then continued more quietly, "I want to not be so alone while doing it." Vincent nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's a worthy dream," he said. "And a difficult one." "All the best dreams are," she replied with a small smile. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the night deepen around them, Vincent said, "I have to return the wagon to Jenkins tomorrow." "Of course," Genevieve said, trying to ignore the disappointment that rose in her at the reminder of his eventual departure. A comfortable silence stretched between them before Vincent spoke again. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice cautious. "The work in Prescott, it's not guaranteed. Just something I heard about." "Oh." Genevieve tried to keep her tone neutral, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "There's plenty that needs doing here," he continued, gesturing toward the homestead. "Repairs before winter, and that south pasture could be expanded with some effort." "Are you offering to stay?" she asked directly, unwilling to misunderstand his meaning. Vincent turned to face her, his expression earnest in the dim light. "For a while, at least. As a hired hand, if you'll have me. I'm good with livestock, decent with crops. I could help get things in order before the cold sets in." A hired hand. It was a practical solution, one that preserved propriety while addressing her need for assistance. Yet Genevieve couldn't help but feel a twinge of something like disappointment at the formality of the arrangement. "I can't pay much," she admitted. The homestead barely provides enough for one as it is. Room and board would be fair compensation for now, he replied. Once we get things running better, we can revisit the arrangement. We. The simple word carried a weight of possibility that made Genevieve's breath catch. It wouldn't be proper, she said hesitantly. A single woman with a man living on her property. Vincent's expression grew more serious. I'd sleep in the barn, of course. And I give you my word as a gentleman that your reputation would be safe with me. Despite his reassurance, Genevieve knew that tongues would wag an ash fork regardless. Yet the practical benefits of his proposal were undeniable. Winter would arrive before long, and there were a dozen tasks she couldn't manage alone. More than that, though she was loath to admit it even to herself, she had come to value Vincent's company during these few days. The prospect of returning to complete solitude after experiencing the simple pleasure of shared meals and conversation was bleaker than she'd expected. All right, she said finally. Until winter, at least. We can see how it goes. The smile that spread across Vincent's face was worth whatever gossip might come. You won't regret it, he promised. We'll have this place running smooth as silk by the first snow. As they sat together in the growing darkness, Genevieve wondered if she had made a wise decision or a reckless one. But watching Vincent's profile as he gazed at the stars, she found she didn't much care which it was. The following weeks established a rhythm to their days that Genevieve found both productive and surprisingly comfortable. Vincent returned the borrowed wagon to town and came back with his few possessions, which he installed in the small tack room of the barn after making it habitable. True to his word, he approached the homestead's needs with diligence and skill. The sagging barn roof was repaired, the windmill restored to full function, and the chicken coop reinforced against predators. Together, they harvested the late summer vegetables from Genevieve's garden and preserved what they could for the coming winter. Vincent's experience with livestock proved invaluable. He gentled a half-wild Mustang that had been hanging around the edges of the property, transforming it into a serviceable mount for Genevieve, whose own horse had died the previous winter. He also traded labor with a neighbor 10 miles distant for 2 young heifers, the beginning of what he hoped would become a small herd. Cattle will be more profitable than just the crops, he explained as they watched the animals explore their new pasture. This land can support maybe 20 head with proper management. My father always wanted cattle, Genevieve said, leaning against the newly repaired fence. Never had the capital to start. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective, Vincent replied. Your neighbor needed that barn raised more than he needed these heifers. Fair trade for both parties. His ability to see opportunities where she had seen only obstacles continually impressed Genevieve. Where she had been focused on mere survival, Vincent envisioned a thriving operation. More than his practical contributions, though, Genevieve valued the companionship he provided. Their evenings were spent in conversation on the porch or by the fire as the nights grew cooler. Vincent had a gift for storytelling, sharing tales of cattle drives and frontier towns that transported her far beyond the confines of the homestead. In turn, Genevieve found herself opening up about her life before Arizona, her childhood in Boston, the rigid social expectations that had chafed at her even as a young girl, her mother's death that had devastated her father and set them on their westward journey. You ever regret coming west? Vincent asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the October wind howling outside. Genevieve considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted, when winter seems endless or when the crops fail or when I'm sick with no one to help. She paused, then added, but no, not really. Here I'm free in a way I never could have been in Boston. My life is my own, for better or worse. Vincent nodded, understanding in his eyes. Freedom has its price. What about you? She asked. Any regrets about your wandering life? He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. I've seen more of this country than most men ever will, met good people and bad, learned something everywhere I went. He looked up, meeting her gaze. But there are nights on the trail when the loneliness cuts deep, when you wonder if anyone would notice or care if you just disappeared. The raw honesty of his confession resonated with Genevieve's own experience of isolation. I understand that feeling, she said softly. Their eyes held for a moment too long, and something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement of mutual understanding that went beyond words. Genevieve looked away first, suddenly conscious of the impropriety of such intimacy, however innocent. Vincent cleared his throat and rose to his feet. It's getting late, he said. I should turn in if we're to finish that north fence tomorrow. Of course, Genevieve replied, grateful for his tactful retreat. Good night, Vincent. Good night, Genevieve, he answered, and the sound of her name in his deep voice lingered in her mind long after he had gone. As October gave way to November, a new tension had begun to underlie their interactions, a current of unspoken attraction that both acknowledged through careful avoidance. Vincent was scrupulously respectful, never crossing the boundaries of propriety, but Genevieve caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart beat faster. For her part, she found herself paying greater attention to her appearance than was strictly necessary for homestead work. The fabric Vincent had brought from town had become a new dress, adorned with the ribbon he'd chosen. She wore it for the first time when they rode into Ash Fork together in mid-November for supplies. Their arrival in town caused the stir Genevieve had expected. Two unmarried people living on the same property, regardless of the sleeping arrangements, was fodder for gossip in a small frontier community. She held her head high as they made their purchases at Jenkins' store, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments. Miss Harrington, Jenkins greeted her with exaggerated surprise. A pleasure to see you in town, and Mr. Blackburn as well. His gaze moved between them speculatively. Mr. Jenkins, Genevieve replied coolly, we need supplies for the winter. As Vincent listed their requirements, Jenkins' wife emerged from the back of the store, her eyes widening at the sight of Genevieve. Miss Harrington, she exclaimed, we'd heard you had company out at your place. She smiled thinly. How fortunate for you to have help. The implication in her tone was unmistakable, and Genevieve felt her cheeks warm. Before she could respond, Vincent stepped forward, his manner respectfully formal. Mrs. Jenkins, it's a pleasure, he said. Miss Harrington has been kind enough to employ me as her foreman these past weeks. The homestead is coming along nicely under her direction. His calm assertion of their proper business relationship, combined with his subtle compliment to Genevieve's management, momentarily silenced the older woman. I see, Mrs. Jenkins said finally. Well, it's good to know you're being looked after, Miss Harrington. Thank you for your concern, Genevieve replied evenly. Mr. Blackburn has been an invaluable addition to the homestead. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon Vincent had again borrowed from the livery, Genevieve sighed heavily. That will be all over town before sunset, Vincent shrugged. People will talk regardless, best not to give it too much thought. Easy for you to say, she replied with a wry smile. Men aren't judged as harshly for such arrangements. No, he agreed. It's not fair. He hesitated, then added, if my presence is causing you difficulty, I could. No, Genevieve interrupted firmly. I won't let wagging tongues determine the fate of my homestead. Besides, she added more lightly, you haven't finished that irrigation ditch for the south field yet. Vincent's smile warmed his entire face. "Can't leave a job half done," he agreed. Their journey back to the homestead was companionable, with Vincent pointing out improvements they could make come spring: a new fruit orchard on the eastern slope, expanded vegetable gardens, perhaps even a few beehives if they could acquire them. As they crested the final rise and the homestead came into view, Genevieve was struck by how much it had changed in just a few weeks. The sagging fence was straight and strong, the barn roof repaired, the yard cleared of the debris that had accumulated during her father's illness and after his death. It looked cared for in a way it hadn't in years. "It's starting to look like a proper place again," she said softly. Vincent glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "It always was a proper place," he replied. "Just needed some attention." The first snowfall came in early December, blanketing the homestead in pristine white. Genevieve awoke to find Vincent already outside, clearing paths between the house, barn, and chicken coop, his breath clouding in the crisp morning air. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he called as she stepped onto the porch, wrapped in her heaviest shawl. Genevieve nodded, taking in the transformed landscape. "Beautiful," she agreed, "but it means winter's truly here." Their original arrangement had specified Vincent's employment until winter, but neither had mentioned his departure as the cold weather approached. Instead, they had worked together to prepare the homestead for the coming months, stockpiling firewood, ensuring the livestock had adequate shelter, preserving the last of the fall harvest. Now, watching him work in the snow, Genevieve realized how accustomed she had become to his presence. The prospect of his leaving created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. Vincent approached the porch, brushing snow from his coat. "We should get the rest of that firewood stacked on the porch before the next storm hits," he said. "Looks like more weather coming from the north." "Vincent," Genevieve began hesitantly, "our arrangement." He stilled, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, winter's here," she continued, gesturing at the snow-covered landscape. "So it is," he agreed, his voice revealing nothing. Genevieve took a deep breath. "I thought perhaps, if you had no pressing obligations elsewhere, you might consider staying on. The work will be lighter in winter, but there's still plenty to plan for spring." The smile that spread across Vincent's face chased away the cold better than any fire could have done. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Very much." Relief washed over Genevieve. "Good," she replied. "That's settled then." But nothing was truly settled between them, and both knew it. The unspoken attraction that had been building for weeks hung in the air like the promise of more snow, unavoidable and increasingly difficult to ignore. Winter on the Arizona frontier could be brutally isolating, with snowstorms sometimes cutting off homesteads from town for weeks at a time. Genevieve had dreaded the long, lonely months in previous years, but Vincent's presence transformed the experience entirely. They established new routines for the winter days. Mornings were devoted to necessary chores, caring for the livestock, maintaining their supplies, repairing equipment in preparation for spring. Afternoons often found them inside the cabin, Vincent carving new handles for tools while Genevieve sewed or preserved food. In the evenings, they read aloud from the small collection of books Genevieve had brought from Boston, or Vincent taught her to play checkers with a set he had carved from scraps of wood. The forced proximity of the small cabin might have been awkward, but instead, it fostered a deepening friendship. Genevieve found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she had never expressed to anyone: her fears about the homestead's future, her occasional longing for the cultural amenities of her childhood, her determination to succeed despite the odds. Vincent, in turn, gradually revealed more of his past, his early years in Texas, the painful loss of both parents, his subsequent wanderings through the territories. He spoke of the various jobs he had held, the characters he had encountered, and his growing weariness with a rootless existence. "There comes a time when a man wants something permanent," he confessed one evening as they sat by the fire, a rare blizzard howling outside. "Something that's his own, that he's built with his hands and can be proud of." "Is that why you've stayed?" Genevieve asked, her voice soft in the firelit room. "To help build something permanent." Vincent looked at her directly, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly I've stayed because of you." The simple honesty of his statement hung in the air between them. Genevieve's heart pounded in her chest as she held his gaze, knowing they had reached a crossroads that would forever alter their relationship, regardless of which path they chose. "Vincent," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say. He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to say anything," he assured her. "I'm not expecting. I just wanted you to know that you're the reason I'm still here." The restraint in his voice, the careful respect for her position, touched Genevieve deeply. In that moment, she realized that what had begun as gratitude for his help had evolved into something far more significant, an attachment that went beyond practical considerations or mere attraction. "I'm glad you stayed," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. "More glad than I can say." A smile touched Vincent's lips, but he made no move toward her, maintaining the proper distance between them. Yet something had shifted, an acknowledgement that had changed the nature of their companionship irrevocably. Christmas approached, bringing with it a brief respite from the worst of the winter weather. The snow stopped falling long enough for Vincent and Genevieve to venture into town for mail and supplies, finding Ash Fork transformed by festive decorations and an atmosphere of celebration. The town's small church was planning a Christmas Eve service and social, and to Genevieve's surprise, several people specifically invited them both to attend. "Seems your status as a respectable employer has been accepted," Vincent observed dryly as they drove the wagon back toward the homestead. Genevieve laughed. "Or they're simply curious to observe us together in a social setting. Should we give them something to talk about?" he asked, his tone teasing though his eyes held a question. "I think we've provided enough gossip for one season," she replied lightly, though her pulse quickened at the thought. The Christmas Eve service was simple but moving, the small church warmed by lanterns and filled with the residents of Ash Fork and the surrounding homesteads. Genevieve and Vincent sat together near the back, their presence drawing curious but not unkind glances. Afterward, the congregation moved to the town hall for a social, with tables laden with food contributed by the community. Genevieve had baked a batch of her mother's molasses cookies, a recipe she made only for special occasions. As they mingled with the townsfolk, Genevieve noticed a subtle change in how they were received. The initial suspicion that had greeted their arrival in town a month earlier had given way to cautious acceptance. Vincent's quiet competence and respectful manner had apparently impressed even the most skeptical observers. Mrs. Jenkins approached them as they stood near the refreshment table, her expression more cordial than it had been during their last encounter. "Miss Harrington, Mr. Blackburn," she greeted them. "How lovely to see you both. I trust your homestead is weathering the winter well." "Very well, thank you," Genevieve replied, surprised by the woman's friendly tone. "Mr. Blackburn, I understand you've made quite a few improvements to the property," Mrs. Jenkins continued. "My husband heard from the Petersons that you've expanded into cattle." Vincent nodded. "Just beginning, madam. Small steps." "Well, it's good to see the Harrington place flourishing again," Mrs. Jenkins said with apparent sincerity. "Your father would be pleased, Miss Harrington." As the woman moved away to greet other guests, Genevieve turned to Vincent with raised eyebrows. "That was unexpected," he smiled. "Success earns respect out here. Word's gotten around about the changes at the homestead." "Our success," Genevieve corrected him quietly. "I couldn't have done it without you." The evening concluded with carols singing, the assembled voices filling the town hall with music that stirred memories of Christmases past for Genevieve. As they joined in Silent Night, she felt Vincent's hand brush against hers, their fingers briefly entwining in the shadows between them. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the crowded room. When she glanced up at him, the expression in his eyes made her breath catch a mixture of tenderness and longing that mirrored her own feelings. The drive back to the homestead was quiet, both lost in thought as the stars glittered overhead and their breath clouded in the frigid air. The landscape was transformed by moonlight on snow, creating a world of silver and shadow that seemed removed from ordinary concerns. When they reached the homestead, Vincent helped Genevieve down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. They stood close together in the yard, neither quite ready to end the evening. "It was a lovely service," Genevieve said, her voice soft in the still night. Vincent nodded. "Reminded me of Christmases when my mother was alive. She loved the carols." "Mine too," Genevieve replied, the shared memory creating another bond between them. Vincent looked down at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Genevieve," he began, then hesitated. "I know this isn't proper, but I need to say it. These past months working alongside you have been the happiest of my life. You've given me something I'd almost stopped believing in, a sense of home." Genevieve's heart pounded as she met his gaze. "It wasn't a home until you came," she admitted softly. "Just a place I was trying to hold on to." Vincent took her gloved hand in his, a gesture both respectful and intimate in the moonlit yard. "I don't want to presume," he said carefully. "You hired me as a foreman, nothing more. But my feelings for you have grown beyond our arrangement. I care for you, Genevieve. More than I've cared for anyone." The words Genevieve had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself were now spoken aloud, changing everything. The proper response would be to step back, to remind him of the boundaries between them. Instead, she found herself moving closer. "I care for you too," she whispered, the admission both frightening and liberating. "More than I thought possible." For a moment they stood perfectly still, the confession hanging in the cold air between them. Then Vincent lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and touched his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper. Genevieve had been kissed before, awkward, fumbling encounters with boys in Boston that had left her unimpressed with the experience. This was entirely different. Vincent's kiss was tender yet confident, conveying both restraint and a deeper passion held carefully in check. When he finally pulled away, his expression was a mixture of joy and concern. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though his eyes suggested no real regret. "Perhaps not," Genevieve agreed, a small smile playing at her lips. "But I'm glad you did." They parted for the night with a new understanding between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that could no longer be contained by the pretense of a purely professional relationship. As Genevieve lay in bed listening to the distant sounds of Vincent moving about in the barn, she knew that everything had changed, though what the future would hold remained uncertain. The weeks following Christmas brought a gradual deepening of their relationship. Vincent remained in the barn quarters, preserving propriety, but their interactions took on a new warmth. Hands would brush while working together, gazes would hold longer than necessary, and occasionally, when sure they were unobserved, They would share brief kisses that left them both wanting more. Yet alongside this newfound happiness, practical concerns remained. The homestead was slowly improving under their joint efforts, but it was still far from prosperous. The harsh realities of frontier life didn't disappear simply because two people had found each other. In late January, during a rare mild spell that melted some of the snow, Vincent announced his intention to ride to Prescott to inquire about selling their small cattle herd's future calves. "The railroad's coming closer," he explained as they discussed the plan. "Beef prices are rising. If we can secure a contract now, it could mean real security for the homestead by next year." Genevieve noted his use of "we" and our subtle indications of how he had come to view his place in the homestead's future. Yet they had never explicitly discussed what that future might be beyond the current season. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, trying to keep the apprehension from her voice. Despite all that had developed between them, a small part of her feared that once away, Vincent might decide not to return. 3 days, maybe 4, he replied. "Depends on the weather and how long the negotiations take." Genevieve nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite her misgivings. "It's a good plan," she acknowledged. "The homestead needs to generate more income if it's going to survive long term." Vincent studied her face, reading the concern she tried to hide. "I'll come back, Genevieve," he said quietly. "This is where I want to be." The simple declaration eased her fears somewhat, but still, watching him ride out the following morning left Genevieve with an emptiness she hadn't expected. In just a few months, Vincent Blackburn had become essential to her life in ways that went far beyond his work on the homestead. The days of his absence stretched interminably. Genevieve kept busy with the routines of the homestead, feeding the livestock, collecting eggs, mending clothes, but the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet without Vincent's presence. At night, she found herself listening for sounds from the barn before remembering that he wasn't there. On the 4th day, a winter storm blew in from the north, bringing howling winds and fresh snow that quickly obscured the trails. Genevieve stood at the window, watching the whiteout conditions with growing anxiety. If Vincent had started back from Prescott, he would be caught in the storm with little shelter between towns. The day passed with no sign of his return, and as darkness fell, Genevieve built up the fire and placed a lamp in the window, a beacon if he was trying to find his way back to the homestead through the blizzard. She stayed up late into the night, alternating between pacing and sitting by the fire, straining to hear any sound above the wind's howl. Dawn brought no relief. The storm continued unabated, and Vincent had not returned. Genevieve forced herself to eat, to tend to the necessary chores, to keep faith that he would arrive when the weather cleared. But as a second night approached with no word, her fear grew into a cold certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally broke, leaving a transformed landscape of deep snowdrifts and crystal-clear skies. Genevieve was considering the desperate measure of trying to ride to the nearest neighbor for help when she spotted a dark figure, moving slowly through the snow toward the homestead. Heart pounding, she threw on her coat and waded through the drifts to meet Vincent, who was leading his exhausted horse on foot. His face was wind-burned, his clothing crusted with ice, but he was alive. "Vincent!" she cried, reaching him and throwing her arms around him without thought for propriety or restraint. He embraced her with equal fervor, holding her tightly despite his obvious exhaustion. "I made it," he said hoarsely. "Got caught in the storm a few miles out. Had to wait it out in a line shack." "I was so afraid," Genevieve admitted, pulling back to examine his face. "When the storm hit, I know," he interrupted gently. "I was worried too, about you here alone. Together they made their way to the homestead, where Genevieve insisted on tending to Vincent before he even saw to his horse. She helped him out of his frozen outer clothing, settled him by the fire with blankets, and prepared hot coffee and what food she could quickly assemble. Only when color had returned to his face did she ask, "What happened in Prescott? Were you successful?" A smile broke through Vincent's weariness. "Better than I'd hoped," he replied. "Secured a contract for all the calves we can produce in the next 2 years at premium prices. Gave them your father's name for the homestead, the Harrington Ranch. Has a good sound to it." The news should have elated Genevieve. It represented security for the homestead that she had never thought possible, but all she could focus on was that Vincent had returned to her, had fought through a blizzard to keep his promise. "You could have been killed," she said softly, the reality of how close she'd come to losing him suddenly overwhelming. Vincent reached for her hand, drawing her closer to where he sat. "But I wasn't," he replied. "And now I'm home. Home." The word contained everything Genevieve had longed for during the lonely months after her father's death: security, belonging, connection. Looking at Vincent's face, tired but determined, she realized that he had come to embody those things for her. "Yes," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "You're home." The days following Vincent's return brought a subtle shift in their relationship. The storm and separation had clarified what might have taken months to acknowledge otherwise, that what existed between them was no fleeting attraction or convenience, but something deep and lasting. Though Vincent continued to sleep in the barn to preserve Genevieve's reputation, they no longer pretended their feelings were anything but what they were. They spoke more openly of the future, planning improvements to the homestead, the Harrington Ranch, as it was now officially known, with the assumption that both would be there to see them realized. February brought another trip to Ash Fork for supplies, where they found the town buzzing with news of a spring festival planned for Easter. Mrs. Jenkins cornered them in the store, insisting they must attend. "It's to raise funds for the new schoolhouse," she explained. "There will be a dance in the evening. The whole county will be there." On the journey home, Vincent asked casually, "Would you like to go to the festival and dance?" Genevieve glanced at him, noting the careful neutrality of his expression. "Are you asking to escort me, Mr. Blackburn?" She teased gently. A smile tugged at his lips. "I believe I am, Miss Harrington, properly and in public, no less." The prospect of attending a social event openly as a couple rather than as employer and employee held a certain appeal. "Then I accept," Genevieve replied. "Though I warn you, my dancing skills are rusty at best. Fortunately, I have 2 left feet myself," Vincent confessed with a laugh. "We can stumble through it together." As they continued toward home, Genevieve realized that something fundamental had changed. For the first time, they were making plans that acknowledged their relationship to the wider community. It was a step toward a future neither had explicitly defined, but both clearly desired. The weeks leading up to Easter brought the first signs of spring to the high desert, patches of bare ground appearing as the snow melted, early wildflowers pushing through the soil, and a softening in the air that promised renewal. The homestead, too, showed signs of rebirth, with the cattle growing visibly restless as calving season approached. Vincent spent long hours in the barn, preparing for the new arrivals that would secure the ranch's future. Genevieve worked alongside him when she could, learning the intricacies of cattle management that had been outside her experience. "You're a natural with them," Vincent observed one afternoon as they checked on a pregnant heifer. "Your father would be proud of how you've taken to ranching." "He wanted me to sell the place after he died," Genevieve admitted. "Said it was too hard a life for a woman alone." She stroked the heifer's flank gently. "But I couldn't let it go. It was all I had left of him." Vincent watched her with a thoughtful expression. "And now, is that still why you stay?" Genevieve met his gaze directly. "No," she said softly. "Not anymore." The simple admission hung between them, pregnant with meaning neither was quite ready to put into words. Yet both understood that the time for such words was approaching, that the future they had been planning together required a commitment beyond their current arrangement. The Easter festival arrived with perfect spring weather, clear skies, and mild temperatures that brought people from miles around to Ash Fork. The town had been transformed with bunting and flowers, and tables laden with food filled the town square. Genevieve wore her best dress, the one she had made from the fabric Vincent had brought, with the ribbon carefully sewn along the collar. When she emerged from the cabin to find him waiting with the wagon, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt he'd purchased in Prescott, the appreciation in his eyes made her blush like a girl half her age. "You look beautiful," he said simply, helping her onto the seat. "You clean up rather well yourself, Cowboy," she replied with a smile, using the term that had once been merely descriptive but had become an endearment between them. The festival was a lively affair, with games for the children, a shooting contest for the men, which Vincent entered at Genevieve's insistence and won handily, and various handicrafts and preserves being sold by the women to raise funds for the schoolhouse. Throughout the day, Genevieve was conscious of how differently they were received by the townsfolk. Where once there had been suspicious glances and whispered comments, now there were friendly greetings and invitations to join conversations. Their success with the homestead had earned respect, but it was the obvious regard between them that seemed to have softened the community's judgment. As evening approached and the dancing began, Vincent led Genevieve to the area cleared for the purpose. "Ready to risk your toes, Miss Harrington?" he asked with a twinkle in his eye. "With you, always," she replied, taking his hand. Despite their professed lack of skill, they moved well together, finding a natural rhythm that matched the lively fiddle music. Vincent's hand at her waist was warm and steady, his steps sure despite his earlier claims of clumsiness. "You misled me, sir," Genevieve accused lightly as they turned about the floor. "You dance quite competently," Vincent chuckled. "My mother insisted I learn. Said no son of hers would shame her at social gatherings." "She taught you well," Genevieve observed, enjoying the rare glimpse into his childhood. As the evening progressed, the music slowed, and couples drew closer together. Vincent's arm tightened slightly around Genevieve's waist, his cheek nearly touching her hair as they moved to the gentle melody. "Everyone's watching us," Genevieve murmured, aware of the curious but not unkind glances directed their way. "Let them," Vincent replied softly. "I'm proud to be seen with you." The simple statement warmed Genevieve more than any elaborate declaration could have done. In that moment, surrounded by the community and held in Vincent's arms, she felt a sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for too long. As the last dance ended and they prepared to leave, Vincent suggested they walk for a few minutes before starting the journey home. The night was mild, the stars brilliant overhead as they strolled to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. "I've been thinking," Vincent said when they paused to gaze at the distant mountains silvered by moonlight, "about the future, our future." Genevieve's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "Have you?" He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "When I found you on that porch last summer, I had no plans beyond the next job, the next town. I certainly never expected to find." He paused, searching for words. "To find home and love." The word hung in the air between them, spoken at last after months of being felt but not expressed. "I love you, Genevieve Harrington," Vincent continued, his voice deepening with emotion. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just as your foreman or hired hand, but as your husband, if you'll have me." Tears sprang to Genevieve's eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so intense it was almost painful. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for months now." Vincent's smile illuminated his face in the moonlight. "Then will you marry me? Make the Harrington Ranch truly ours together?" "Yes," Genevieve answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Vincent Blackburn." He gathered her into his arms then, kissing her with a passion that had been restrained for too long. Genevieve responded with equal fervor, all concerns about propriety forgotten in the joy of their shared commitment. When they finally parted, breathless and laughing, Vincent pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't have a ring," he admitted. "Not yet." "I don't need one," Genevieve replied honestly. "I just need you." The ride back to the homestead passed in a blur of happiness and plans for their future. They would be married in the church in Ash Fork. As soon as arrangements could be made, no reason to wait, when they had already proven they could build a life together. As they approached the homestead, their home, Genevieve was struck by how different it looked from the neglected property she had struggled to maintain alone less than a year ago. The fences were straight, the barn solid, the house itself somehow more welcoming, with a curl of smoke rising from the chimney against the night sky. Vincent helped her down from the wagon, but instead of releasing her, he swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the yard while she laughed in surprised delight. "What are you doing?" she gasped when he finally set her on her feet. "Practicing," he replied with a grin. "For when I carry my bride over the threshold." Genevieve's laughter faded into a smile of such tenderness that Vincent's expression grew serious in response. "I never thought I'd find this," she said softly. "After my father died, I was so alone, I thought I'd always be alone." "Never again," Vincent promised, drawing her close. "From now on, whatever comes, we face it together." 3 weeks later, on a perfect May morning, Genevieve Harrington became Genevieve Blackburn in the small church in Ash Fork. The entire community turned out for the event. The same people who had once gossiped about their arrangement now celebrating their union with genuine goodwill. Mrs. Jenkins had organized a wedding breakfast in the town hall, and Mr. Jenkins himself proposed a toast to the couple's happiness and prosperity. The Petersons, whose heifers had formed the beginning of their cattle herd, presented them with a fine young bull as a wedding gift. When they finally returned to the homestead, to the Harrington Blackburn Ranch, as the freshly painted sign now proclaimed, the future stretched before them, full of promise. The challenges of frontier life remained, but they would face them as partners in every sense of the word. Vincent carried Genevieve across the threshold as promised, setting her down in the cabin that had been transformed by their joint efforts over the past months. Fresh curtains hung at the windows. New furniture built by Vincent's hands stood alongside pieces that had belonged to Genevieve's father, and flowers picked that morning brightened the table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackburn," Vincent said, his voice husky with emotion. "I've been home since the day you found me," Genevieve replied, drawing him down for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love to come. 5 years later, Genevieve sat on the expanded porch of their ranch house, watching as Vincent taught their 3-year-old son, James, to sit on his first pony. Nearby, their infant daughter, Elizabeth, slept peacefully in her cradle, her tiny features a perfect blend of her parents'. The homestead had flourished beyond anything Genevieve could have imagined during those difficult days after her father's death. The cattle herd now numbered over 50 head, with calves fetching top prices thanks to Vincent's careful breeding program. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper ranch house, with a separate bunkhouse for the 2 hired hands they now employed during busy seasons. Ash Fork itself had grown with the arrival of the railroad, bringing new opportunities for the ranch to prosper. Vincent had recently been elected to the town council, his straightforward manner and business acumen earning him the respect of even the most established citizens. Yet for all their material success, Genevieve knew that the true wealth of their lives lay in the family they had created together. Each day brought new joys and challenges shared between partners who had found in each other the home they had both been seeking. As Vincent lifted James down from the pony, and the boy ran toward her, his face alight with excitement, Genevieve thought back to that fever-racked morning when she had collapsed on the porch at dawn, too weak to help herself. How strange that her lowest moment had led to her greatest happiness, all because a passing cowboy had stopped to help and had promised, with simple words that held within them a lifetime of commitment, "I will care." And he had, every day since.